it seems to me important to start with the lead, which is, what's the basic question here? What's at stake here? Why should we care deeply about these issues? You could get into the curious character of reality, all the stuff of quantum entanglement and all of that, which leads in interesting directions, and you will start to talk about information theory and how only on that level can you get the solution to certain kinds of problems. Great, that moves us in the right direction. I think it's important to start, however, simply by saying what's at stake here are two different views of reality. Let's just talk in the most general terms to start with, because we're hoping to draw in people who don't necessarily have any training. And here's like a headline issue. Like, what's really, in just general terms, we can refine later. We can get into the qualifications necessary. But in very simple terms, what do we stand for? Why do we think this issue is important? Could it be of overwhelming importance? I think it is. I think that it may be the case that thinking of the world in a certain way is the key to certain forms of human transformation. And to me, ultimately, that's the most important issue. I'll be frank about that from the very start. That although we're interested in how these things work, even on the level of photons and in biology as well, and all sorts of systems, ultimately, as human beings, certainly one of our main preoccupations is going to be, what does this mean for us and the way that we live our lives?
Well, to me, as a scientist, my personal opinion is that the dialogue between science, philosophy, and religion has atrophied significantly to the point where it's actually affecting our culture. I happen to be a youth counselor at our church for 10 years, and I worked with the high school kids. They've basically been taught that science has answered all the questions, and there's no room for God, there's no room for religion anymore. It's all been overthrown. They struggle with that if they happen to have parents that bring them to church.
How does that, let me interview you on that subject then. How does that intersect with what we're doing? I mean, let me address it in terms of some of the basic categories of religion, of church, synagogue, whatnot. One of the things that people might be curious about is whether or not any of the traditional hopes that religion used to give us really are still alive. Is this what you're saying? Are you saying that what we have to say actually shows that that's a very, very narrow view of science? Science actually gives us much more reason to develop religious instincts that we have always felt. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. The reason why I would go into detail in a simplistic manner of many of the recent advances is this gives us a way of bringing both the philosophy and the religion end of things into what science has discovered, that indeed we're dealing with a number of people that I call the evangelical atheists, that basically have said there's nothing but random chance in the world and there is no spirituality, there is no God, there's no point in even looking. But they're a very small minority. If you look at all of the quantum scientists in the early 1900s and read their writings, they were all very deeply spiritual individuals that were trying to reconcile their science with their beliefs.
Okay, so let's be clear about this then. There's something very, very big at stake in trying to prove that what you have been calling the materialist worldview is false. Let me break in with a question, by the way, terminological question, because the words that we use can be important, and at least we should fasten a few things down. In philosophical terms, the classical antithesis to materialism, I'm just talking about the term in the history of philosophy, is idealism. Sometimes people who don't know philosophy very well have a mistaken idea. Idealism sometimes in English means having high ideals and whatnot. That's important. But in this particular usage, idealism means the theory that mind is the fundamental reality. Full stop. Now we can talk about mind on various levels. We could talk about the question of does the universe itself have a super mind, sometimes called God? But however we construe it, classically in philosophy, the antithesis to materialism, which says that ultimately thoughtless matter is the fundamental reality, and all things are made of thoughtless matter. Even the things like us that think are ultimately only made up of material things. We are material through and through. We're just complex matter, okay? Matter, of course, is the word contained in materialism. They drop a T for curious reasons in the spelling, but matter, materialism. Matter is ultimate. In idealism, it doesn't necessarily involve the denial of what we call matter, but it says that if you look very closely, you find out that this gets things entirely upside down. The idealist says that mind is the ultimate reality, and that this makes all the difference in the way we see the world. Now, first of all, is the word idealism congenial enough to use? Should we use it? Should we use another term for the antithesis? We should discuss that.
It's the proper term. It's just not a term that's well known, I think, in the scientific community. Right. I want to go back to one statement you made.
Yes.
I would not consider scientific materialism wrong. It is simply limited. And there's not a vigorous discussion around the limitations of scientific materialism. So it's not that it's wrong or it produces incorrect information, but it's like Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a revision of Newtonian physics.
Of course, it's true that the material point of view, materialistic approach to things is fruitful. I don't want to deny that, but still and all, materialism, with a stress on those last three letters, the ism, is the claim that material reality and the material point of view is everything. Okay, that we need nothing else than that. In that sense, materialism is an all-encompassing theory. It doesn't just say we have to look at things from a material point of view. That's one point of view, but we must not leave, you want to add, but we must not leave out these other realities. As far as I'm concerned, material reality and all the findings of science and whatnot that have dealt with what we call matter, but looked at very, very closely, doesn't it turn out that what we have been calling matter, as if it were just dead stuff, I think it comes down to this in crude language. It comes down to this. The old idea of materialism was the idea that you could build anything theoretically out of off-the-shelf chemicals, to put it one way. There's nothing that isn't in some complicated way a combination of off-the-shelf chemicals.
Yeah, and I think you're getting at it here. And the reason why we need to go into a bit of what's going on the science end is that when we talk about matter for eternity, just about, human beings have thought as matter as being fundamental.
Right.
Science is based on looking at matter in the outside world as an impartial observer. We're not part of the system. What we're now learning is that matter is not fundamental. It's derived. What's fundamental are fields. And that's very different than matter. So it tends to shift your whole worldview of what that world can include if you realize that, as the early Hindu philosopher said, the world that your senses provide you with is an illusion.
Okay, but it's at this point when you introduce fields. Sorry for interrupting, but I want to take the point of view of somebody who might be listening to us talk, and who says at this point, what's the connection with fields? Why are fields important? And I want to point back to my question. Ultimately, are you saying that there's something about the character of Fields which is in accord with the idealist so-called idea that mind is the fundamental reality, that fields allow us to see mind or information theory or whatever you want to get to as being the fundamental viewpoint here, that ultimately you do get back to this theme that what we see here is that nature itself is mind-like. Is that correct interpretation of where you would want to go?
Yes, and one of the reasons, as we'll see, that there's been such resistance to making the statement fields are primary and matter is derivative, is it opens up what many scientists would think as a very slippery slope of now including the mind and fields involved with other things that interact with the fields of nature, that the mind itself has a field, and it's supported by many of the things in quantum field theory that show that, as we'll find out, what you decide to do changes the reality of what you measure.
So the entanglement that you sometimes speak of when we talk about Bell's theorem and all these strange phenomena in quantum theory, where two particles that are light years apart could be instantaneously correlated in an interesting way. But here I hear you saying something very interesting about entanglement, that we ourselves are entangled in the world, that there's entanglement between us and the object. And here we get to another perennial theme in philosophy of science that you have talked about, which is that we have here perhaps the end of the notion that we have an independent subject and an independent object. We have an object out there which is separate from the subject, and which the subject can look upon, catalog, and talk about exhaustively. Instead, I think you're trying to say, no, there's no separation of the investigator from the investigated, that both are inextricably entangled in a single system.
That's exactly right. To put it in very simplistic terms, everything, the way entanglement works, it's particles that were joined together that were now separated. Basically, everything in the universe is entangled because it all came from the Big Bang. So there really isn't any part of the universe that's not involved in non-locality and entanglement.
Yes, but it does say that space isn't what we think it is either.
That's exactly right. The whole definition of space has changed from a stage on which things happen to space is now a participant in everything, because a field is a property of space. It is not a property of anything else other than space. So we look at the different fields, and there, as we know it right now, there are 6 of them. They are literally a property of space, and matter is then generated from that. Indeed, there are actually scientists that are kind of on the bleeding edge of this, that claims that in the end we'll find out that there is nothing but mind, that the mind is actually the primary creator and manifestator of the universe, and that everything else is secondary to mind.
And I think at some point soon, we've got to connect that also, this whole idea of entanglement and so forth. We have to include in the discussion something having to do with the essentially holographic character of things, that a large part of the solution to the puzzles and the paradoxes that have afflicted modern science can be dispelled if we start to see that the parts do contain the whole, that the entanglement means that each particular particle does contain, in some sense, reference to its other within itself. They are other referring. They are interrelated. They are poles of a polarity, each one of which needs the other pole in order to have its proper reality. Just as positive and negative in electricity, or both are essential, or you don't have electricity at all. You need the polarity. The fundamental reality is the polarity between these two things. So although you have this difference turns out to be at bottom one system of interaction. And it's the interaction that is the reality itself.
As we'll find out, there's a lot of dialogue now between physicists and neuroscientists.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out where the brain fits in.
Okay.
And the thing that's, if you want to know why this is interesting and people should pursue it, one of the more fundamental questions is, do we, in some form, survive the death of the brain? Is there a legitimate mechanism that would allow the information that is us to survive the physical death of the brain? So that, to me, would be a big motivator.
And this is one, let me point out, this is another place where the connection with religion, I don't like the word religion all that much, frankly, but going to church or synagogue and all that stuff does come in. Because one of the categories of hope, I called it hope before, that religion has given us is that death is not necessarily the last thing. Common to our religious traditions is very often something which materialists call just a consolation, the consolation of a belief that we can survive death. But one of the most important things about the dispute between materialism and its adversaries is that its adversaries believe that since, as you might put it, information is the primary thing, and since we already know that information can be offloaded and stored elsewhere, and we can start to think of things according to a brand new model. Is it fair to say that once you start to get oriented in this direction, things that seemed impossible, like survival of death after all the body falls apart, can be answered by saying yes, but you're ignoring the fact that it's not the hardware that's at stake here. It's the intelligence that's at stake here.
What's happening now is there's an opening up of scientific materialism says there is not space for the spiritual. There's not really, fields are not really materialistic. Matter is materialistic, but fields are not. Fields extend through the whole universe and communicate instantaneously because everything's part of the field. That's why some of the early quantum physicists were making references back to the Hindu religion, because many of these same ideas that of what reality is in quantum theory is now coming close to a lot of things that were meant that are in the early Jewish religion, the Hindu religion. You see emerging now, rather than that's religion, science can't touch it, it's off limits. Now you're seeing people starting to crosstalk. You see neuroscientists talking to physicists.
Yeah.
You see them talking to spiritual leaders and meditators to find out what exactly goes on in the mind when you meditate, that people claim that they go to an alternate reality. People who survive near-death experiences that can recount things that went on in the room almost verbatim when they were technically brain dead. All of these things are now no longer considered as nonsense. The way that they are being brought in is there are now people that I would call scientific idealists.
Okay.
That embrace that definition of idealism.
Okay, so there are scientists who believe, just to remind ourselves, that one way or another, mind is the ultimate reality governing what happens in the universe. That mental events are the primary reality.
I can't remember where I saw it, but it was a statement made by someone that, philosophers are really the same as religion. They really don't have a place in science because they deal with stuff that can't be proven. That's entirely incorrect. They deal with things that can't be addressed by the scientific method, but that doesn't mean they can't be discussed and investigated and basically plow the field for new ideas of things that we might be able to do.
Now, I want to interject something here. When I try to make sense of the fact that mind, and I do believe this, is the fundamental reality, and I try to apply that to the world at large, because after all, if it's the fundamental reality, it means you see it everywhere. One of the things that attracts my interest most of all when it comes to trying to define what it is that I mean by saying this is that in some sense, some very important sense, intelligence is out there. And that without understanding how intelligence works, you won't understand some of the major steps, for example, in natural history. To get back to the quantum idea, to me, the quantum-like, jump-like character, quantum leap is what I'm talking about here now. The fact, for example, if you go back in natural history to the origins of life on Earth some 4 billion years ago, now they've pushed that boundary all the way back. It's back when I was in college, they thought that life was only about 2 billion years old, and now they think about 3.9, the last article I read, or something of that degree. When life appeared on this planet, the scientists have still not come close to explaining the origins of life on this planet. They give us a promissory note that one of these days we'll understand how, out of sheer chemicals, you get life, but nobody's ever given us a path from sheer chemicals to life in any scientifically credible way. The gap remains enormous. Now, there, again, on this general level in which I want to alert a possible listener to what we're into here, it's there that I want to ask the question, isn't there something that can only be understood in terms of the communication of parts of a system that would, or according to a holographic model in which the individual participants in a larger system now are in some sense involved in a communicative process with one another? Only on the basis of such a model can you understand a leap in natural history like the first appearance of life on planet Earth.
One of the things that drives the scientific idealists is this idea that the universe seems to have been an informed creation, is the way they state it. It would appear that the universe was fertile ground, more than you would expect from a random creation, to wind up with consciousness and intelligence. Everything seems to be baked into the cake that would allow the formation and the creation of consciousness as being one of the primary objectives.
But even before human consciousness, the point is that even on those levels, intelligent things are happening there too. That on the level of the cells, intelligent things are happening there too. They're not conscious processes, but all the way down, we find intelligence at work.
Some of the more progressive people, in looking at bacteria,
yes,
bacteria do things that they shouldn't be able to do without a brain.
Okay.
I mean, they do all sorts of creative things that would appear to have required some sort of conscious thought process involved. Yet they have absolutely nothing that you can point to as a neural material that could even come close. They don't even have a nervous system. Things like that get people thinking, are we being biased in terms of human consciousness, that we may be missing other forms of consciousness that may be around that are different or limited?
Well, what about, I'm going to ask you because, it should be pointed out, you're a trained biologist. Your doctorate is in biology. What about just the manifold character of animal intelligence? I was thinking about this the other day. You know, we arrogantly think we understand everything, we human beings, but to what extent shouldn't we admire, in a certain sense, be in awe of the intelligence displayed by animals that still defies to some extent human understanding? The behavior of the bees, the behavior of the navigation of birds, and return to the sea of the turtles, and all the strange things that go on in nature. You're a biologist, I'm not. But isn't there just in the animal kingdom alone ample examples of things that human beings just have to say, that's awesome. We just don't get how the animals are so clever as to pull off those tricks.
I'll give you an example on a question to you. What animal would you think is probably the second most intelligent species outside of human beings?
Oh my goodness. I've heard various things said about this, including pigs and elephants. So and I've heard people actually, I've heard the advocates of the octopus.
That's exactly where I was going.
Okay.
There's now a huge amount of information. The octopus is able to problem solve. We talk about smart dogs that are able to escape, and they figure out where things are. Now, a dog has a fairly decent brain. Octopuses or octopi?
Well, octopuses, I think
is, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the way to go these days.
They're notorious in aquariums for escaping. At National Aquarium, they will bond to people almost more than dolphins do. Now, the octopus doesn't even have a brain. It has a neural net. It really doesn't have a centralized brain. Yet, one of the more mysterious animals that you won't even think of as putting in to the category of intelligent or conscious, but it probably exhibits more traits similar to humans than dogs and cats and dolphins and whales. It's bizarre.
To move into your specific field of entomology, for a moment, what about the dance of the bees in terms of a phenomenon exhibiting an advanced level? If I understand it, you could explain it to me better, but the dance of the bees is actually a map where the bees, by dancing in a certain way, show the location of the nectar. Is that, do I have that right?
Yeah, there are a number of things that the social insects are one of them. Biology would call those instincts. They were not learned. They were inherited. If you look at the migration of birds and a number of things where this information is more or less imprinted at birth rather than something that is learned, the true mark of intelligence is you are able to learn. You are able to adapt and change your behavior based on your experience. None of that is really there in the social insects or birds or anything like that.
I should warn you in advance that philosophically, I don't accept this clear duality here between instinct and learned behavior. I really believe that what we call instinct embodies intelligence, and these problems were already solved somehow. Yes, they become regularized and they become part of the repertoire with which the animal is born. It's absolutely true. But nonetheless, these are very, very intelligent things. I think dichotomizing it and saying that we can't apply the idea that these are very, very intelligent things just because they are achievements of biological evolution in the sense that they've been fastened down now actually into the DNA of the animal in question. They're still very, very bright processes. They're still processes that demonstrate what they demonstrate. That is to say, if the bees do something which is linguistic, symbolic, if real communication is going in here, then to say, all right, it's already built into them when they're born, that to me even dramatizes. That means that a high level of intelligence has already been programmed into them when they come from the factory, like a computer, you know?
Well, let me make an argument against my own premise that I just stated.
Okay.
If you call the bees' dance a language, go more simple. It's a code.
It's a code.
That means two things. The bee that's doing the dance has to know the code, and all the other bees have to understand the code.
There you go.
That's something that you would not typically attribute to instinct. You're looking at somewhere the code had to come up that both the person that speaks the code and the person that receives the code have a common understanding of what the language is.
And it covers the case of novelty also, because the bee is being presented with information where the nectar is. It may never have been in that spot before. There's something new here that is being communicated, so the recipient of the information can say, oh, today it's over there, and go to the appropriate location. Now, this is in some sense, very intelligent behavior if it is as it appears. And isn't it as it appears? I don't know how much is known about the dance of the bees, by the way.
Well, there's also some things that aren't being considered here. If you look at ants,
Yeah.
Ants find food. And when one ant finds food, all of a sudden there's 10 million ants at the food. Now, ants communicate through pheromones or chemicals. They lay a chemical trail. They communicate with different chemicals. That's something most humans don't even consider in terms of communication. In the ants, you're looking at a very sophisticated mechanism of communicating through chemistry rather than a dance.
In crude terms, they do it through smell rather than...
Yeah, they're doing it through chemical signals that they have receptors for that carry meaning to them. Some of these can be quite complex in what they communicate. So when we talk about things like how do things communicate, a dance is a very visible thing. We don't know that the bee might be doing other things in terms of chemistry while they're doing that adds information to it. So there's a whole host of things here that can be part of this system that we're naively unaware of.
Yeah, and movies. What was the movie 7 or 8 years ago, based upon ants? It's actually quite easy to make a fantasy movie about the life of ants because their social behavior is so. Their labors, their work, their division of labor. Speak of it in terms of all of these very complex things, and indeed, we can't leave out the important point here that these are social animals in some very important sense. So that this overturning notion, I mean, is it fair to say that what we're involved here in this project of ours involves this overturning notion, this overturning of the it's all dead stuff theory, and when you referred to certain people who talk this way, Richard Dawkins came to mind as one of the chief proponents, very grim view of reality, as some would have it, versus a much more hopeful view of reality, which says no, mind is the predominant thing. And once you start to think that way, all sorts of possibilities that you hadn't thought of about what human existence is like, what is possible.
Well, I look at people like Dawkins and I guess Christopher Hitchens and a number of others, that the problem is not that they're not smart. It's the problem of their worldview is very limited.
Yeah.
If you've pledged allegiance to scientific materialism and you're going to live and die on that mountain, then you haven't got much alternative in terms of looking at things that are possibilities. As a scientist that is required to use the inductive method to come up with ideas, if you confine those in that inductive method to only the tenets of scientific materialism, you may be missing out on a whole lot, which is why I think that looking at scientific materialism and understanding what might be its possible limitations is absolutely vital to moving forward.
What's going on in the academy these days, in universities, in biology departments and physics departments? To what extent do we find an actual opening up to alternative possibilities of the kind that you want to talk about? Or is it still very, very highly under the predominance of a more narrow materialistic orientation?
I went in to science because it was free of politics.
Yeah.
I was very wrong.
Yeah.
Science is more political than politics. It's based on reputation. It's based on a pecking order of who are the authorized people to come up with new ideas. And if you'll notice, most of these people that are challenging the system are much older and established and don't much care about preserving their reputations. If you're a young PhD doing a postdoc, you don't have much choice. If you don't kowtow to the system, you'll go nowhere.
I thought, though, that a half a century ago, when people like Stephen Jay Gould, an eminent biologist, started talking about the leap-like character, the saltaic or leap-like character of biological evolutionism, punctuated equilibrium, was the term of the day.
Mm-hmm.
This is already 55 years ago or something like that. I thought that science itself was coming alive to a certain kind of, and this was at Harvard. This was Stephen Jay Gould, the curator of the Museum of Natural History at Harvard, who was writing these articles.
Basically, the way science works, Stephen Jay Gould is a good example. He did come up with punctuated equilibria, and he worked it out with another individual called Niles Eldredge. It made a lot of sense.
And it talked, just so a possible listener would understand, it talked about the fact that evolution was much more leap-like with sudden transformations than Darwin had ever allowed to be possible. Darwin had actually been very explicit that his theory seemed to commit him to a gradualism of development, whereas what Gould and others were saying is, no, we don't find that in the fossil record. What we actually find are leap-like phenomena.
And what Gould's heresy was that he said there are sudden changes and then long periods of basically stability until another change occurs. The common thought in evolution proposed by Darwin is all change is slow and gradual. And what they basically did to Gould was they criticized him a little bit, and then they just ignored him. The way science deals with someone who's being way too innovative is they just simply ignore you.
But he was an eminent man, and it does raise the hope that now, 55 or 60 years later.
Well, the good thing about science is eventually the truth comes out. When enough evidence builds that it's very difficult for critics to ignore, then you get a paradigm shift, and you may not be alive when that occurs, but that seems to be the way it works. In physics, quantum field theory was developed back in the 40s, and it simply laid there, ignored. There were maybe one or two physicists that were working on it, and then all of a sudden, a couple of key experiments are done, and now it's a viable alternative. So those poor people that were working back in the 40s and 50s that pioneered it, they weren't getting any journal space. They went to conferences and presented their stuff, but they were just basically ignored as if they weren't there.
So when we get into this scientific stuff, you wanted to talk, and you're going to talk soon enough, about things like double slit experiments that show the wave-like properties of things, paradoxes that arise because on the one hand, we want to talk about material things as if they were particles, and on the other hand, it seems that it's waves.